The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, March the 30th. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Central Maryland Office of the Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to the webinar on utilization, review, overview, and training. On the panel today, we have Bernie Simons, Deputy Secretary for DDA, Nick Burton, Director of Programs, Rhonda Workman, Director of Federal Programs and Integrity. We have Robert White, Director of Administrative Services. We have Lakeisha Alvarado, who is the QIO Program Manager. We also have presenting today, Jennifer Metrick, Executive Director, Liberty Healthcare Corp. Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. And if you look at the panel interface on your right labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option. So we have one handout for you today. That's in the handout section in the panel on your right. We are recording the webinar and we'll be posting it on the DDA website. And questions can be typed in the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Metrick from Liberty. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Donna. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. You can advance to the next slide and then to the agenda, to the next one. Thank you. So we're going to hear opening remarks today from Deputy Secretary Simon. Then we're going to jump into the overview of the utilization review process. We're going to talk about DDA guidance that's related to the utilization reviews, and we'll also be going over some related Appendix K flexibilities. We're going to wrap the session up today with some upcoming information around the new DDA training matrix that is being developed, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers towards the end. So I'm going to hand this over to Deputy Secretary Simon. And Donna, you can advance to the next slide.
So good afternoon, and I want to thank everybody for attending today's utilization review webinar. The utilization review is the beginning of how we go back and take a look at some of the issues that DDA has experienced with the Office of Legislative Audit's findings, one of which was around utilization review. And, we need to build a robust system that people understand, that's user-friendly. And we know that there has been, with the Liberty organization, some providers who have raised their hand and piloted some tools, et cetera. So, I hope after today's webinar that everybody has a better understanding and feels comfortable with the process. And, and I'm glad that, as Jennifer just said, that the overview is going to be done with step-by-step upcoming utilization. And more importantly, I think, and when I say comfortable with the process, to be able to engage and ask questions. And, there's plenty of time at the end of the webinar to do that. And so, again, I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's a good opportunity to engage, to make sure that questions for clarity and making sure that everybody understands from the Liberty perspective, that they understand the provider perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So again, thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you. Donna, do you want to advance to the next slide? Thank you. So all of the reviews and the work that Liberty has joined with the department to embark on is around this journey towards person-centered excellence. So the utilization reviews are part of that journey. And at this stage, we're really looking to begin building that system of quality. And so that's kind of the stage that we're at right now. And this really starts with ensuring people are receiving services as outlined in their person-centered plans and ensuring those services are provided by qualified providers and staff. So you can go to the next slide. So as you can see here, we have shown this diagram several times, really looks at the overall quality framework for how we're going to move towards system improvement and achieving that person-centered excellence. And so there's three main components in which Liberty is supporting the department to develop that system of quality. So Liberty will be partnering with the Council for Quality and Leadership to evaluate system quality and participant outcomes. That will be done through the basic assurance reviews that will be starting shortly, as well as the personal outcome measures. We'll also be utilizing, and we've already started this process, the National Core Indicator Surveys to obtain participant and family voice, really important component of building that system of quality in Maryland. And then finally, we'll be helping to design evaluations to measure systems compliance. So ensuring that the system is working as it should. So Liberty's data collection activities will be able to answer several questions. To what degree the system is in compliance with the CMS waiver assurances, how well services are being delivered, and if they're having a positive impact on people's lives. So it's really that trifecta that we're looking to collect as part of all of the reviews. As you can see in the next column is really those data collection tools, the utilization reviews being one of them, which we'll be talking about today. All of this information will be pulled together. There will be analysis done for each review, but also in each type of review, but also across reviews, so that we can really look at and determine level of performance around specific quality domains, provider types, service types, even by region, and demographics. So that information can then be shared with the department to really help in the selection of quality enhancement strategies that can be implemented and then continuously monitored with those data collection tools, so that we're really looking to see if they're having the desired impact. So it's all of those components together. So you can go to the next slide. So now why we're here today is obviously to go through in detail the utilization reviews. So all of the information that will be reviewed today will be found in a utilization review standard operating procedure that will be released and put on the DDA website. So the SOP and the communication that will go out with it will come through Constant Contact, and that will be done shortly, hopefully by next week. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through first the purpose of the utilization reviews. Certainly, Deputy Secretary Simons gave us an overview of what's driving those reviews and their importance. We'll talk about those lessons learned from the pilot, how we conducted the pilot, what we learned from it. We'll even provide a little bit of data that came out of the pilot reviews. We'll talk about the different type of utilization reviews that will be conducted. And then finally, we'll walk through step by step the process that Liberty will be following in order to conduct those utilization reviews on behalf of the department. So you can go to the next slide. Okay. So the purpose is really to monitor compliance with federal waiver assurances and the performance measures. The three main questions that will be answered are people receiving services as outlined in their person-centered plans? Is there financial accountability? The main way that we'll be looking at that particular question, there's a series of questions with that, is around verifying service delivery through provider service documentation, and then ensuring that services are delivered by qualified providers. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about the utilization review pilot. We had 5 providers who volunteered and participated in the pilot. They provided a lot of documentation on multiple people that they supported for a variety of services. So we were able to review the largest services from residential to rehabilitation, community development service, a few of the employment services, as well as personal support, and a few others. So those were the main ones that we really focused on, and obviously the majority of the claims are focused on those services. And so I'm just going to talk you through a little bit of what that process looked like for the 5 volunteer providers. We first selected 4 to 5 participants for each of those pilot providers. We selected a particular service for each of the participants, and then looked at a random sampling of claims for a particular time period. The time period was from July 1st, 2022 to September 30th, 2022. And from those claims, we then assigned them to our utilization reviewers who have been trained on a step-by-step process. They used that process to look and review each claim and all of the service documentation that was provided from each of those 5 providers. So then they made determinations on whether standards were met or unmet as part of that process, and ultimately if the payment was deemed a proper payment or not. We pulled all of that information together for each of the claims. We had individual findings summaries for each of the claims, and then an overall summary. And we provided those to each of the pilot providers. Then we sat down and had an exit conference with each of those providers. And so we talked through what we found, why we made certain determinations. We walked through where we saw really positive practices in the service documentation. If there were any unmet findings, we talked about those, and then suggestions for preparing for future reviews. The providers also were then able to submit afterwards supplemental documentation. If there was, for some reason, something missing, or they hadn't thought to provide it to us, or we hadn't thought to ask for it, we really learned through that process how specific we needed to be in terms of those requests for documentation. And so they provided that information. We reevaluated each of the claims based on that supplemental documentation, and then we issued a finalized findings report for all of the claims. And so that was the process we went through. The things that we learned from this process, in most cases, providers submitted service documentation that met requirements, which was great. And staff also were found to be adequately trained with the Appendix K flexibilities. And so there were quite a few times where the Appendix K flexibilities really came into play in that allowance for the staff to be deemed properly trained on the data service. And then the one area that probably had either the most confusion or gave us the greatest challenges was around verifying timesheets of staff that were named on the service documentation. And so many providers are using web-based data management systems to do their service documentation. Sometimes those systems automatically will update the names of staff if somebody has gone in, reviewed it, maybe they added additional information or they needed to make a correction as a supervisor, and it would have the supervisor's name instead of that original service provider or the DSP who had done the documentation and provided the service. So we were able to walk through with the providers during those exit conferences, those situations. They were able to provide supplemental documentation that indicated why the names weren't matching on that service documentation. So those are just a few things that we found. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to go about that when you're submitting documentation in some future slides. So could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So with this, here is some summary data of what we found as through the utilization review pilot. So you can see in the first main row here, we have the number of claims reviewed by each of the providers. We had our 5 providers, around 20 or so claims per provider were reviewed as part of this process. So for a total of 112. Then you can see in the next row, so for our initial reviews, so this is the first time we were looking at the information, the service documentation that was provided. We had 84 total of the 112 that met standards, so met all standards across the board. And then you can see below, we have a breakout of how many did not meet standards. So there was 28 total at the initial review that did not meet standards. And you can see the reasons why. So there was either missing service documentation, there were timesheet discrepancies, there may have been training documentation missing, and in one instance we had a clerical error. So then after we received the supplemental documentation, now you can see in the next column that the number of claims that were met at the final review. So you can see that went from 84 from the initial to 103 of the 112 met all standards after the final review. So we really only had 9 claims out of the entire 112 that did not meet standards after the final review. And so the 2 areas that we found was there was missing service documentation or there were timesheet errors or discrepancies. We couldn't match the timesheets with the service documentation. So the last 2 rows just give you an idea of kind of the amount of claims for all of the claims. So the total for all 112 claims would have added up to about a little over 20,000. And then if this had been a real audit at the time of the final reviews, only about 2,500 or less would have been possible recoupment amounts. So just giving you an idea of what we found in terms of those results. All right, you can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the 3 types of utilization reviews. Today, we are going to focus on the remote and the on-site reviews. The special reviews that would be outside of any of the criteria for remote or on-site is still being developed and will be released with an effective date down the road. But right now, we are focused on the first reviews that will be beginning on April 17th of 2023, just around the corner. They will be focused on these 2 reviews, the remote utilization reviews of random paid claims, and then the on-site reviews. So we'll walk through those in detail. These are fully defined in the standard operating procedure, and you'll see that once that's released. So you can go to the next slide. So we just wanted to take a moment to walk through the review period so everybody is clear on the review period and then the dates of service for the paid claims that will be pulled for each of the upcoming review periods. So for this first one, we're actually getting started a little bit beyond the March 15th date that had been our original date we were going to go live. So we've pushed that back to April 17th. So we'll be reviewing claims April 17th through June 30th of 2023. That initial claims review period will be looking at a full 18 months of claims. And this is related to the OLA findings and the recommendations and the steps that the department needs to take on those. So the claims will be pulled from anything that was provided July 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2022. So this is our baseline. After this initial review period, so when we pull another sample for the July 1st, 2023 review period, that will be looking at only 1 quarter. And we will only be looking at 1 quarter's worth of claims. It's a random sample of those quarterly moving forward after the first review period. So in July, we would be looking at claims where there were dates of service from January 1st, 2023 through March 31st. And then you can see in October, we would be looking at April 1st through June 30th. And then in January, we'd be looking, that's when we'd be starting looking at the new fiscal year, July 1st, 2023 through September 30th, 2023. So it'll go in that cadence for each quarter moving forward. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, so now we're going to walk through all of the steps that the Liberty team will go through with providers to conduct the utilization reviews. So we start with a random quarterly sample of approximately 450 claims per review period. So even for this first period that has a longer look back period from July 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2022, we will still be looking at approximately 450 randomly selected claims. So that sample size is proportionate to each waiver program and state-only funded. It's also then proportionate by region and then also by service type. So that means that obviously we have 2 larger regions and 2 slightly smaller regions, so it'll be proportionate to the regions and proportionate to the service type. So we may have more residential and personal supports or day claims than we would some of the services that there aren't as many claims. So assistive technology or potentially nursing services, those kind of things. The claims will then be assigned to Liberty reviewers based on regional assignment. So we do have regionally assigned reviewers, and they will be doing some reviews cross regions because of the size and the amount of the claims review, but they'll be focused primarily on a particular region so that they can also build relationships with the providers in those regions. And if they're coming on site for an on-site review, that they're more regionally located. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the sample's been selected. The information, and I should have said this, is uploaded into what we call Liberty Tracks, which is our data management system for all of the reviews. It's tracking all of our progress on the reviews, all of the information that we're collecting as part of it, all of our documentation on why we are determining if standards are met or unmet. All of that is going to be in Liberty Tracks. When providers are giving us service documentation, all of that will also be uploaded in Liberty Tracks with the review. So everything is all in one place and can be accessed by the team. So an email notification will be sent out to each DDA provider organization that has a claim or multiple claims selected as part of the sample. And so we're going to be doing those in groupings so that we're managing kind of the flow of information as it's coming in. So we'll be sending out a certain amount of email notifications in the first week, then we'll do some the second week, and so on for that first month, so that, again, we're not getting all of the information for all of the claims all at one time. But providers will receive an email notification. Now that notification is going to go to the point of contact that DDA has provided us. So we have a list of all of the providers. We're getting that updated on a monthly basis from the department, and there are points of contact that are listed in that data file that is coming to us. So we know that the points of contact may not be what you want for the utilization reviews, and that's okay. You can also email us. There will be a contact email that goes out, or an email address, a general email box for Liberty for the utilization reviews. You will be able to email us additional contact information if you want a different point of contact. So we'll store that, so we'll know that for any future reviews as well. So that is fine to do that. We can have more than one contact stored in the data system. So email notifications will go out. Providers will have 5 business days to respond to those documentation requests. So in that email notification, there will be a checklist. So based on the service that is being reviewed for the claim, will be a specific list of required documentation. And all of that is based on DDA's guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation. So that is all listed in that document, which is on the DDA website. It's also linked 5 different places in the standard operating procedure, so you can easily link to it. That's where that required service documentation is coming from. The qualifications for the staff, that comes directly from Appendix C for each service in the waiver that talks about the qualifications. So those training requirements and any specific qualifications, like if it's an employment service and you're billing out of LTSS for, let's say, job development, then you would need, that staff person would need their CESP certification to be able to obviously bill for that service. So that kind of documentation. All of that will be clearly outlined in that email notification. So again, providers will have those 5 business days to respond to those documentation requests. We will make sure that we kind of have a return receipt so that we know if the emails have been opened. If they haven't, we will reach out via phone to the provider organization to make sure someone has received the email, or if we need to send it to a different contact email. So we want to make sure that the providers are receiving these. All right, you can go to the next one. All right. So we're still on notification. So as I was mentioning, the required service documentation will include anything that's required in DDA's guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation, that guideline. It's been out since 2019, and it's any of the revisions are in red, but the latest version is up on the website. So when applicable, and it'll say in that guidance, when applicable, an employee timesheet for verification is required. And then also, when applicable, employee training qualification records, including the employee date of hire, because there are differences between new hires and those that have been with the agency over time. So there's obviously differences in training requirements for that, and then obviously the completion dates for those trainings. And again, all of this will be detailed in that checklist. So you can go to the next one. Okay. So when we're preparing for the reviews, we'll receive the documentation from the providers. We will upload that into Liberty Tracks, as I had mentioned, and we provide our providers 3 days from the time that they receive the information to start those reviews. They also have 3 days they need to have those reviews complete. So we're really holding our reviewers to a high standard to make sure that these are moving through quickly, because we also want to be able to have time to get out the initial reports to all of the providers for the claims review. So there also would be time for the submission of any supplemental documentation. So if for some reason we have not received, we have tried to reach out to the provider, we have had no successful attempts at that, we have not received any documentation, we move forward with the review. I mean, we're not going to have a lot of information without that service documentation. We'll do the parts that we can through the information that's listed in LTSS Maryland, and we'll issue a report. If for some reason there was a reason that that service documentation was not submitted, providers still would be able, once they get that initial report, to submit the documentation before the final review. Okay. So now we can go to the next slide. Okay. So here's when we start the actual remote review. So it's on each remote review is one random claim. That's what consists of a remote review. The indicator questions that are associated with that review. So we are answering these 4 questions. Is the claim supported by documentation that services were delivered? Was the person eligible on the date of service, and was the service authorized in the PCP? Did the employee or employees who delivered services for that claim meet all required training and qualifications on the date of service? Was the claim coded and paid for in accordance with the reimbursement methodology specified in the waiver? We need to check to make sure that it was accurately paid. Those are the 4 questions. There are some sub-questions, particularly for the first one. So is the claim supported by documentation that services were delivered? So we have 4 sub-questions that all need to be met for that particular indicator question to be met. So if applicable, was the date of service with start and end times included in the service documentation? Within that guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation, in that guideline, it is clear per service when there needs to be dates of service with start and end times as part of the service documentation. It is outlined there. So that's why it says if applicable. So do all of the service documents identify the correct participant for that claim? So we need to make sure everything matches. Was service documentation consistent with the guidelines? So was the correct type of service documentation provided? Sometimes that includes a service note, sometimes it doesn't. Each service outlines what those specifications is in the guidance document. And then if applicable, does the timesheet confirm that the staff worked on the data service during that time of service delivery? So those are the sub questions for that first one. Is the claim supported by documentation that services were delivered? Again, all of this, all of the questions, it is all outlined specifically in the standard operating procedure that's going to be released. Okay, you can go to the next one. All right, so the initial findings report. If there are no unmet findings found for the claim, the utilization review is closed.
Absent undue hardship. The ABAAA requires that if the management team and or employer are unable to provide the accommodation, that they explain in writing.
Excuse me, can we mute the person that's talking?
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. I'll start over for this slide. So for the initial findings report, if no unmet findings are found, the utilization review is closed and a finalized findings report is set for that claim. We will compile all of the claims reports. If for some reason a provider has more than one claim that's being reviewed during a review period, we'll compile them together instead of just individualized reports. We have them as individualized, but we can pull them together. If it's the only claim that was reviewed for a provider and it's final, everything was met, then we'll send that report out as well as provide it to the DDA regional director for that's associated with that provider agency and our contract monitor. If there are unmet findings, here are the things that would qualify for an unmet finding. So if there were less services provided than billed, so the service documentation doesn't support the full amount of units that were billed for some reason, then that's less services provided than billed. If services provided did not match the definition of the service, so let's say what was defined in service documentation was for a specific employment service, but what was billed was rehabilitation, that wouldn't be a match. If the staff qualifications couldn't be confirmed or the staff providing the service wasn't appropriately qualified, and that's if there weren't other qualified staff working alongside of them, if they were working independently with somebody. And then unmet findings where payments cannot be substantiated by the appropriate service documentation. Okay, you can go to the next one. All right, so step 8. So the initial findings report or finalized, if there are no unmet findings, will be sent out within 3 business days of the review being completed. We want to make sure there's timely turnaround. If there are unmet findings, the provider will have 10 business days to provide supplemental documentation for the purposes of remediating any of the unmet findings. So if there is something else that you have that shows and can demonstrate the staff did work during that time, or There was, there was documentation that showed why a supervisor had to complete the note or the service documentation, anything of that nature. If that's outlined and that is acceptable documentation, then that can be submitted within 10 business days. Then from that, the reviewers will upload that supplemental documentation, they'll review it, they will re-review the findings for that claim and make any adjustments as appropriate. And then they'll create that finalized findings report. Okay, you can go to the next one. So if after we've finalized that first claim, if there are any remaining unmet findings in that finalized report, so before we send it out, we look if are there still unmet findings. We will pull 3 additional claims for the same service to be reviewed for that provider. So we will go through the same steps, 3 through 9, that we just talked about above, if there are still unmet findings for that original claim. So that means we will notify the provider. Again, we'll provide that additional 5 business days to provide service documentation for the 3 additional claims. And then we'll go through that same process. You'll still receive an initial report for those 3 additional claims. You'll still be able to have an opportunity to provide supplemental documentation if applicable. And then there will be a finalized report for all 4 claims. So the original and then the 3 additional claims. All right, we can go to the next one. All right, step 11. So you have the remote review is done after we've finalized all of the findings for the 4 claims, the original and the 3 additional. And this is all if you had unmet findings for that original claim. If you didn't, you've been done the process. But if you did, then we send you the final information for all 4 claims. The only time we would be coming on site, here's the criteria for an on-site review, is if there was no service documentation submitted for any of those 4 claims. So there just was none submitted at all. Nothing to review the claim by. Or if there is more than 1 claim that was reviewed with the same discrepancy. So 2 criteria: no service documentation was submitted for any of the 4 claims, and if there was more than 1 claim that was reviewed with the same discrepancy. Okay, so we go to the next one. All right, so a notification will go out to the provider if an on-site review is necessary. It will go to that point of contact, or if there's an additional contact that you've provided to us, that's who the notification would go out to. It will go out within 15 business days of completing those additional remote reviews. So the final, once you have received within 15 business days of that final report on all 4 claims. So the purpose of the on-site review, well, we'll get to that. I'm sorry, I just jumped ahead. So first, the communication that will go out, that notification will include the list of people that we would like to talk to for that on-site review. So any of the participants of the claims that were associated with the claims, the staff associated with the claims, and any administrators that we should be talking to that are related to the service documentation for those claims. So we will have a consent process for participants, so they can choose whether or not they speak to us. They, of course, will have that choice, and we will ask providers to help us to create that schedule to come on site within 5 business days of being notified of the on-site review. I know this is a lot of information. I'm trying to repeat it a couple of times. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the Liberty Review will be looking, that on-site review is interviewing, again, participants, staff, administrators. The purpose of the on-site is not to look for additional issues, but really trying to ascertain in general, are people receiving the services as they're outlined in their person-centered plan? Are there any issues that they're bringing up? But really, it is about helping the provider to not have unmet findings moving forward with these claims reviews. So it is to do some root cause analysis to really look at if there are systemic issues, how can we help you to develop a corrective action plan so that this isn't happening moving forward. So that's really the purpose of those on-site reviews. Okay, you can go to the next one. All right, once the on-site reviews are complete, a summary of the information that we compiled and where we see some of the strengths, but also where some of those, what are some of those drivers that are causing the discrepant findings, the unmet findings on the claims. We'll be reviewing that in a summary report. We will be providing technical assistance at an exit conference. So, and again, this is all to assist the provider to develop a corrective action plan so that those unmet findings aren't happening moving forward. So the exit conference will be scheduled within 5 business days of the completion of the on-site review. And we can do those virtually. So we don't have to come back on site for those. We could just do those virtually with the administrative team to walk through the information that we found, walk through some suggestions around how they could develop their corrective action plan. Okay, we can go to the next one. All right, last steps in the process. I know it's a pretty lengthy process. So if a corrective action plan is required, then the provider agency would submit that corrective action plan to Liberty for approval within 30 business days after that exit conference. So we'll review it. Most likely, we've already helped you develop it, so we'll be turning around and approving that. If there's any back and forth, we'll do that. Once it's approved, then the provider would have 30 business days after to submit evidence that they've implemented their corrective action plan, if applicable. So that is the process. Liberty will then provide the finalized corrective action plan to the DDA regional director associated with that provider and the contract monitor, and they'll send a letter that indicates that the corrective action plan has been implemented and accepted within 5 business days back to the provider agency. So once they've submitted that evidence, then we'll turn that back around and and send them a letter indicating that the cap is closed. So again, with the special reviews, that process is outside of this remote and on-site review process dealing with randomized claims. And so more will come around what those special reviews may entail and the criteria associated with those. Okay, that was a lot to take in. I do remember that I did not specify one area that I want to make sure is clear. With the finalized reports, so after the remote reviews, and that could be with one claim, or if there's still unmet findings, that could be with 3 additional claims. If there are still unmet findings and they're associated with it cannot be deemed a proper payment, that will be indicated on that final report that is provided to the department, and they will follow up through their existing processes if there needs to be recoupment of payment. So I realized I did not say that before. I want to make sure that I mentioned that. So that's not a liberty process, but the information that's provided from that finalized report will go to the department and they'll follow up from there. Okay, so that is the information that walks us through all of the steps of the process. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the related guidance. I've been talking about it throughout, but we're going to get into a little bit more detail. So do you want to go to the next slide? And then we can actually hit the next slide. So Rhonda, would you like to talk about the service documentation requirements?
Sure, thank you. Appreciate it, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everybody. So you've heard Jennifer talk about supporting documentation in terms of the utilization review. Liberty will use the service documentation requirements listed in the DDA's guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation to determine if appropriate service documentation exists to support a proper payment of a claim. The guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation was developed some time ago with stakeholders, including providers. Providers shared their current documentation and information that they were collecting at that time and maintaining. The first release of this document was in 2019, and it's been updated over time with the last updated version dated March 29, 2022. This guidance is on the DDA website under our person-centered planning page, and you'll find it about midway through the page. All updates to the guideline for service authorization and provider billing documentation are indicated in red font for each of the most recent changes. Next slide, please. This slide is an example from the guidelines for service authorization and provider billing guidance on service documentation requirements. For community development services, the guidance states required documentation includes, first, an activity log listing of all people in a group, limited to no more than 4 people, to include in and out times and the location of service provisions. Second, a service note describing the service / or activities as authorized by the person-centered plan. And providers should maintain copies of staff timesheets that document the presence of staff who provided the service under the hours billed. Please note that as per the DDA's Appendix K and guidance, there may be some exceptions to the requirements that are noted in our guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation guidance. The DDA's Appendix K for this service, CDS, includes the flexibility to exceed the group size up to 4 people. So these would be considered, as Liberty is doing their work, to look at the Appendix K flexibilities, exceptions to any of the rules. The DDA will be updating the guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation guidance to align with changes made in the recent waiver renewal upon approval from CMS. The DDA will also be conducting waiver renewal update training leading up to July. So the next steps will be us updating that guidance that will be released with an effective date of July 1st, 2023. Next slide.
Thank you, Rhonda. So as Rhonda noted in the example with community development service, one of the required service documentation items was a service note with describing the activities provided during that service as outlined in the person-centered plan. So we wanted to provide an actual service note that we received from the pilot. I know there's been quite a few questions that have been raised. What needs to be in a service note? And so it really, if it includes information that's in that guidance, so if it includes activities as outlined in the person-centered plan for that service, then, and it's connected to that particular participant, then that is showing us the service documentation that's required for that service note. So here's just an example, real-life example of a community development service note, which indicates the activities that the person engaged in during community development service and how they were supported. It also provides the start and end time for that service and the staff member that provided it. So this is a good example of the kind of documentation that you could include in a service note. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. So another question that was raised as part of the pilot and additional questions that we've received as we've been developing the utilization reviews is around when does the service documentation have to be collected, when, who is required to do the service documentation. So based on the CMS guidance, Medicaid services should be completed contemporaneously. So we're going to really use this word, contemporaneously, which means that it's in the moment, it's when the services are provided. So it's that same period of time. So service notes, or all service documentation, not just service notes, service documentation should be indicated by the person who is providing the service. And so there can be more than one staff on, and there may be only one staff that documents, and that's fine. But it's the staff that are actually providing the service should be doing the service documentation, and it should be done contemporaneously. CMS also indicates if for some reason that can't happen, maybe a staff just inadvertently had to leave their shift early, there was an emergency, something happened, they weren't able to do their service documentation for that day. They may have emailed a brief summary to their supervisor, and their supervisor went in the system and documented on their behalf. That just needs to be clearly identified in the service documentation when another person documents on behalf, why, and it's clearly articulated. So that information can be provided at the time that Liberty is asking for that service documentation. So if you're reviewing it before you're sending it in and you see that a supervisor, not the person that actually delivered the service, sometimes the systems, the data management systems, again, if they automatically update, if there was even just a correction, a spelling correction or something like that, it updates to the last person that put documentation in that record. And so if that is indicated and corrected and it's identified what's the original content, and then the change that a supervisor or other made in that service documentation, that can be provided at the time that you're submitting service documentation to Liberty. We just want to make sure that everyone had that guidance. All right, you can go to the next slide. Okay. So as Rhonda mentioned in the example from the Community Development Service, one of the Appendix K flexibilities that is currently in place or has been in place during Appendix K is staffing ratios for certain services did not have to be upheld at all times. So there could have been 5 people in the CDS group for that particular day. And if that's the case, then that's allowable under the Appendix K flexibilities. There's also several flexibilities related to training. And so especially for newly hired DSPs during the pandemic, there were flexibilities such as being able to take online CPR and first aid instead of the in-person versions. Individualized training, however, for the person on their person-centered plan, their nursing plan, or behavioral support plan, if applicable, still remained a requirement. Many of the required trainings were not required right from the start of them providing supports, but fundamental rights was also one of the required trainings that stayed in place and includes content around people being free from abuse, restraint, and seclusion. And also one of the continued training requirements was around having, it could be a condensed version, but having verification that the staff had been trained and had received the policy for when reportable incidents and investigations, a PORI. And then if applicable, that they did have their medication technician training if they were doing any kind of delegatable activities. So those are all examples of kind of the reduced version of required trainings during that Appendix K period. So all of those kinds of flexibilities will be taken into consideration for each and every claim review, and it will be based on the specific dates of service. So whatever Appendix K flexibilities were in place on that date of service will be utilized as part of the review. So that's an important clarification that we wanted to make sure everybody knew. Okay. So to end us out today, before we get to questions, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, Nick is going to walk us through the upcoming training matrix that will be coming out shortly.
Thanks, Jen. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? This is just the header slide, but I get to talk about everybody's favorite topic, team training. I know you're all really excited to see what DDA's been up to around this. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. So we have actually been working with many of you, my team and I. We've been working with a lot of you, your training leaders, your QE leaders, and really talking about what you're all using for training, the trainings that you have in place, the documentation you're doing on trainings. And we've been using that to help develop a training matrix. And I think I'm fairly biased, but I think our training matrix is looking pretty slick right now. It really takes into account all of the different trainings that are required, whether that be in waiver or policy. It includes some of the things that have been consistent in terms of training that have happened. There also are different columns that outline who the training really applies to. It outlines the COMAR authority or the policy authority. So we don't just say waiver, we actually link to the authority in which you can go find word for word that training is required. We also will be linking to the policy. We'll also be having a resources column that will provide you with resources or different trainings that exist that meet the expectations related to that particular training requirement, understanding that you all have some, we have some, there are some that have been developed, we have some in, I know that you all have some systems that you utilize, that you access training. So my goal and my team's goal is to get this draft matrix out to partners, you guys, within the next couple of weeks for you to give us some feedback. We'll probably try to schedule a feedback session to get some ideas, see how it feels, see if you feel like it's going to meet your need, if there's anything else we need to add. We really want to make sure we're getting your input on that so that we can have that finalized and ready to go by June 1st, so that you have a month to continue to soak it in, share it with your teams, review it with your teams, so that by the time July 1 rolls around, you're ready to go, it's implemented. And I know that this will be helpful as many of you are starting to or continuing to prepare for the unwinding of Appendix K and making sure that those training requirements are in place. In the meantime, if you've got any questions or ideas or thoughts or things you've just been dying to share with me about training matrices, please send me an email. We are very open to ideas about how this can look right now so that it's useful for all of you. I think that's all I got, Jen.
Thank you, Nick. That was great.
Yeah.
I think we can go to our last slide and start fielding some questions.
Okay, so hello everyone, this is Lakeisha. And the first question is, what constitutes service documentation?
I can take that one.
Okay.
The service documentation is what is required and listed in the requirements in the guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation, that guide that we talked about today. That is where all of the listing is for each service. There are different service documentation requirements, and it's listed in that document by service.
Thank you, Jen. Next question is, will there be recoupment amounts owed during the initial baseline period? Who would like to take that question?
Hello, this is Robert White, Operations Director for DDA. As Jennifer mentioned, once they have wrapped up their reviews, they will forward those on to the DDA. When we receive those, we'll take a look at it and make that determination based on what's been submitted.
Thank you, Robert. Next question is, will we have access to these slides after the presentation?
I can take that. They are attached to the presentation. I believe if you look in the box, there's handouts. You can click on that and download the presentation.
Hey,
Also,
Jen, this is Nick.
okay.
Just an FYI, there were several chats. I know you were speaking, so you didn't get to see all of them, but there were a couple of comments that on one of the slides, it looks like maybe one of the steps was missing. So it might be worth going back and checking the slide deck that got uploaded, and then we can probably resend to all the participants just so everyone has a fresh copy.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Next question is, for the 18-month look back, will you be asking for all documentation for that period or just some sample, or just some sample time frame during those months?
So the random selection of claims will be from that time period. We'll only be requesting documentation for the specific claim. So a provider could potentially have one claim, multiple claims, or no claims selected during the time period. But it's only for that claim, and a claim, I should have said this, is for 1 day of service. And so for, let's say, community development service, it would either, if it was something billed out of PCIS2, that would be for a day of service on that particular data service. If it's billed out of LTSS, then it would be for the units billed for that day for that service.
Next question, will the recording be sent to us?
I believe Donna indicated that the recording will be uploaded on the DDA website.
Will a staff timesheet that only shows hours and dates suffice for the review? If the dates suffice for the review, if the organization has a specific hours of operation, or does the timesheet have to include clock in and clock out times? And the question should be to Jennifer.
The timesheet should have clock in and clock out times. If it doesn't, and there's some type of supplemental documentation, like a staffing calendar or dates or times of operation that can go along with a timesheet that only has hours, then we certainly would review that to make that determination.
Why does the review go back 18 months? And that question towards Robert.
Yeah, hi, sure, thank you. So the review goes back 18 months because it closes the gap between when the time period that the OLA last looked at for our most recent audit and the findings associated with that, and when they come back. So we can't have that gap there because it really does leave us open or exposes us to a repeat finding.
Next question is, who is the contract monitor? And that is me, Lakeisha Alvarado. And I can put my email in the chat. Next question is, who defines what is allowable supplemental documentation and how is allowable defined? Jennifer, do you want to take this question?
Sure. We will look at anything that we are provided to see if it substantiates that the service was provided. So sometimes that could be an additional activity schedule. There could be something where there was a supervisor that submitted documentation, and so there is additional supplemental indicating why and what the original documentation was from the person that provided the service. So it is difficult to say exactly in every instance what would be allowable, but we're certainly looking to be able to take anything that would substantiate the service, the timesheet, those kinds of things, if we're not able to do so with the original documentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Excuse me. Next question is, when should we expect to receive the SOPs?
I can take that. It's in final review and review of the communication that will send the SOP out and alert people that it's on the DDA website. So that can take a few days to get that through the comms process, and then it should be released hopefully next week.
Thank you. Next question is, what if you're still billing in PCIS 2 and the funding does not align with LTSS?
So I think I can take this question. When there are still service definitions and they're applicable, there's outlines of how those services are applicable in both PCIS 2 and then LTSS. So if you are billing in PCIS 2, let's say it's something like supported employment, then we're looking for the documentation that would be relevant to supported employment. Hopefully that answered your question.
Next question is, there has been mention that it is required that documentation be at the same time as the service. Where is this documented as being required? It is not policy, the waiver, regulation, or Appendix K. Either Rhonda or Jennifer.
As we noted earlier in the webinar, there is guidance from CMS that service documentation should be done contemporaneously. There are reasons and rationale why that sometimes is not submitted for a couple of days, and it is allowable if that's documented why it couldn't be done contemporaneously. But that is standard practice.
There are specific deadlines for providers to complete steps in the review. There are no deadlines and specific, sorry, wrong question. The service note that was provided in the presentation is considered one that meets the requirements, correct?
That is
question,
correct.
Jennifer? Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
I think we talked about this one. The handout goes from step 6 to step 7. Step 8. 7 doesn't appear to be included. Jennifer, you want to?
Sure, I added that. It was in the talking points, but I also added that, and we'll resend out the PowerPoint.
Next question is regarding the presence of service logs. This is only for providers that have gone live in LTSS, correct?
No, that is not correct. The service documentation that's listed in the guidelines for service authorization and provider billing documentation for each and every service, whatever is in the requirements for that service, regardless of whether it's filled out of LTSS or PCIS2, there are some distinctions there for certain services, but it is what is in that documentation requirement list in that document that we would be looking for. Service notes is one example of service documentation, and it is listed if it's a requirement for each service. It is not required for all services.
Just to confirm, for DayHab service documentation needed, you will require the specific time the person started DayHab and the specific time the person ended DayHab for that day. Jennifer?
Yes, that is correct.
Just for clarification, the standard operating procedure is coming soon, or is this available somewhere now?
It is coming soon.
Is there a way for us to see who you are listed as the point of contact before the reviews start? Jennifer?
That's a great question. That is a list that we received from the department. So I may just need to confirm that we would be able to send that out, but that would have, I don't know that we would be able to individually send out those point of contacts to everyone, but we can look into that.
Is there a list of locations for training requirements under Appendix K and after Appendix K? Also, currently, while under Appendix K, is there still online training available? And question to Nick.
So this is Rhonda. I'll add some thoughts there and others can join. The Appendix K training flexibilities are currently on our dedicated website for Appendix K. It includes that chart that lists the flexibilities that are still in place. In terms of online training options, they are provided by various entities such as CPR and first aid. That would be something that the provider would be looking at and doing related to that. So those are available. And then finally, as Nick had shared, we will be sharing a training matrix to kind of show you the requirements going forward.
Is the 450 selected claims for each quarter the total sample for the state, or is this the sample size for region or provider/program?
It is the total sample for the state.
Thank you, Jennifer. If staff enter a service note early in their shift does that cause any issues? For example, if the service note was created at 4 p.m., but the shift lasted until 11, would the note be considered sufficient?
If it included information based on the requirements in the service authorization and billing guidance, then yes.
If it's one claim per day, would you only need one service, not per day? For example, if an individual gets community living, group home services, they could have 2 to 3 staff shifts to provide that service per day. Would each shift need a note?
There needs to be notes that describe the full day of service. So that is a day service. And so it should cover the information and the service provided during that shift. Again, I'm going to take you back to the service authorization and billing guidance to look for the requirements. But yes, it would cover all of the shifts as part of that day.
Thank you, Jennifer. How many Liberty reviewers are there?
There are 4 reviewers and a supervisor, and then there's also a manager that oversees the whole process.
How do we verify if our agency point of contact is correct?
That's a little similar to the other question that was asked. We'll look to see if there's anything we can do to get that information out, but that should be up-to-date information that the department has and is compiled and is sent to us on a regular basis so that it's up to date. So typically those points of contact are the CEOs or executive directors of the agencies. And again, when we send that out, if we do not receive a receipt confirmation, we'll make sure to reach out to that agency to get the correct contact.
Sorry. How are the results from the review claims applied to those that were not reviewed? Jennifer.
Not sure that I understand that question. All of the claims that are pulled for the sample will be reviewed and results will be shared, whether there are unmet findings or everything is met.
For example, under CDS, if one part of a list of documentation is not present, if all required information except the location of the activity is documented, for example, how will that be considered an audit review, compliant or not compliant?
If all the components of the requirements are not there, then it would not be met.
Do the hours worked for CDS need to be entered on the CDS tracking sheets where the goals are recorded, or is it okay if the hours worked are reflected in the CDS timesheet?
It's fine that the hours would be reflected in the CDS timesheets.
Thank you. Can you elaborate on what is meant by a training matrix? This question is for Nick.
Yeah. It is a document that is broken down by columns and rows that outline the different required trainings per waiver, per policy, per COMAR. It also has a column that tells you who the training applies to, when that training needs to be taken by, and it also provides you with resources that meet the standards regarding the training. Does that help? Not that you can answer me back, but I'm going to assume that might help.
Thank you, Nick. Can we get a copy of the CMS requirements? Rhonda, can you answer that one?
I think they're referring to the CMS guidance that Jennifer shared. I believe it's on her slide that actually notes the reference to the guidance.
Okay. Well, Jennifer could answer that.
That's correct, yes.
Are all providers receiving remote reviews first before on-site review criteria is met? Jennifer.
As we walked through the steps, the only way that you would have an on-site review is if the original remote review of a claim had unmet findings at the time that they were finalized, and then we pulled 3 additional claims for that same service. They also had unmet findings, and then the criteria, thirdly, would need to be met that there was no service documentation for any one of those 4 claims, or that there was a similar discrepancy found for more than one of those 4 claims. So that would be the only time that there would be an on-site review.
Thank you. Can the service note say if you have check boxes that say bathing, meal prep, goal building, or does it need to be in a statement/paragraphs?
As you saw in the example that we showed, not all of the information is in a statement or a paragraph. So if the activities or the types of supports have check boxes that indicate that those supports were provided, that also is completely applicable for the service note.
This question is for you, Jennifer. How is Liberty interpreting the service authorization billing chart for residential habilitation, since it lists a few items and says, etc.? Are reviewers going to consider multiple ways to document the service?
So based on the guidance, if it clearly articulates so if it's multiple things that are required, then we will look for those multiple things. If there is an or that says you could have one thing or you could have another, then it would be either. So, and if we don't receive any of what's required, and there may be some additional supplemental that is related, could be used in lieu of, we'll do what we can to be able to substantiate the service and ensure the required documentation. But we're really looking at the exact wording that's in that service authorization and billing guidance for each service.
What if you have a single apartment house with one individual, but they only have 20 hours a week? Do we have to provide 6 hours of service per day in order for them to be present, or can we count the hours they slept in the unit?
So what I would have to go back and look specifically at the guidance and if what was provided is in alignment with the service definition.
Those are all the questions.
Thank you, Lakeisha. Did anyone want to close us out today? I really appreciate everyone's patience walking through the questions. I did want to say we will be taking the questions that you asked today, as well as questions that we've received from our collaborative work group and others that have submitted questions along the way as we've been developing the utilization reviews, to be able to incorporate them into FAQs. Those FAQs will then be included in DDA's overall FAQ list on the DDA website. There is already a QIO section. We're adding for each of the reviews FAQs specific to the reviews, and those will be added shortly as well once we're able to compile them. Any other closing remarks?
Hi, this is Donna. Thank you for attending today's webinar and for posting your questions in the question box. And as always, we value your feedback, and we will review and respond to frequently asked questions and post them on our DDA website. So we just say, please stay healthy, and thank you again for your dedication to our DD community. We're going to end the webinar.